Castro sent his military and took over foreign refineries in Cuba. President Eisenhower declared a complete trade embargo and ordered the CIA to recruit Cuban exiles trained to destroy Castro's regime. So what they wanted to do was the CIA wanted to take down Castro, but they didn't want to necessarily say it was them. So they wanted to do it like unsuspiciously and not be at fault for the things that happened in Cuba. So they did it more secretly, even though we found out years to come. So on April 15th, so on April 15th, 1961, six American bombers disguised in the colors of the Cuban flag Air Force took off from Nicaragua for an attack on Cuban airfields. So only 3 Cuban planes were destroyed and 7 civilians were killed. This wasn't exactly our best attempt to take down Castro's Air Force because we only had 6 American bombers, which weren't a lot, and Cuba was more of like a step ahead of us, and were able to tell kind of what was happening when it happened. So it wasn't exactly the best plan of action to take down a portion of Cuba. So 15,000 exiles arrived at the Bay of Pigs, which is 125 miles from Havana, and then Kennedy canceled the Air Force help. And this actually was a big letdown for the US because this this gave us not an upper hand, but the downfall of our failure for this. And Kennedy was at fault for this completely because he didn't take control of being in high authority and being the president. So a lot of people died from Kennedy's mistake of trying to take down Cuba again in another failed attempt. So taking the Air Force out of it to help out the people on the ground was one of the biggest mistakes he'll probably do. In the Bay of Pigs on January 1st, 1959, a young Cuban nationalist named Fidel Castro drove his guerrilla army into Havana and overthrew General Batista. So the CIA, which is the Central Intelligence Agency, attempted to push Castro from power, which is the one thing we really wanted to do. So in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis inflamed American-Cuban-Soviet tensions even further. And it was Americans up against Cuban and the Soviets. And on the picture to the right, Havana was more closer to the north part of Cuba on the northwest side. And then we were kind of smack in the middle of more to like the east, the like mid-east for the Bay of Pigs. So pretty close to Havana, but we wanted to take another angle to take over, but it definitely failed in the American attempt. So the first 72 hours, all invaders were killed or captured. In the spring of 1962, a practice invasion of a Caribbean island was mounted by 40,000 American Marines. And in July 1962, 150 Soviets loaded with heavily distinguished nuclear missiles and over 40,000 troops sailed for Cuba. So the Soviets and the Cubans were now allies and against the Americans. So on October 14th, a U-2 spy plane was ordered to fly across the island to discover what's going on in Cuba. So an American spy plane flew over Cuba to see what was going on, and it actually showed to our dismay that the Soviet troops were helping out the Cubans. So on October 16, the CIA informed Kennedy Soviet missiles are in Cuba. So Soviets successfully got missiles to Cuba, so if the Americans did something, they were able to bomb us and have loaded power, and it was terrible because it was the Soviet Union was backing up Cuba. a decision was made to blockade Cuba. This was called a quarantine. This would convey to Khrushchev to remove the missiles. Khrushchev denied all of Kennedy's demands to remove any missiles from Cuba. So Khrushchev denied all of Kennedy's demands, and on October 26, at a meeting with the Soviet military commander, he was informed about the missiles. This day, Khrushchev telegrammed for the president. So he said, if the U.S. doesn't invade Cuba, that the Soviet ships and everything will disappear. This was not necessarily a treaty, but an agreement between the Soviet Union and the president that the Soviet Unions will take their missiles out of Cuba. And then there will be no blockade and we will not attack Cuba. But Khrushchev got super greedy and wanted to up the agreement a bit for more control on his side. So he denied it, and not necessarily denied, he agreed to it, but the next day later he demanded for a trade instead. So the trade was his missiles in Cuba, that he would take his missiles out of Cuba if the U.S. missiles were taken out of Turkey. This gave the Soviet Union an upper hand, because if we take the missiles out of Turkey, we have no way to bomb the Soviet Union easier. So this definitely made it harder on the U.S. side to fight against the Soviet Union. So the Soviets took the deal. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union. This is the only part of the agreement that the Americans knew and that the Soviet Union people knew. So everyone that was under the Soviet Union power only heard one side of the trade, which was the Soviet Union backed down from the U.S. and took everything out of Cuba. But the U.S. actually took the missiles out of Turkey, because if not, then we would go to war with not just Cuba, but the Soviet Union, and possibly lose the war and create catastrophic damage to not just Cuba, not just the U.S., not part of the Soviet Union, to many, many countries. So this would have been like World War III. No one knew about the agreement to take missiles out of Turkey. So it was only known for Khrushchev and the people, maybe like the president and a couple more people. So no one knew about it, but neither the Soviet Union or the US won. It was not just a tie. It was more like it was more like a lose-lose situation. But in many people's eyes, it was the Soviet Union's loss, because they didn't challenge the U.S. They ran away more and took all their stuff with them back to their own country. But the people high up in the Soviet Union knew what was going on and knew that the missiles were taken out of Turkey. And for their people to think that they were weak was the greatest thing for them, but no one would challenge them. So neither the U.S. or the Soviet Union won this kind of agreement. So it was a kind of a lose-lose situation on both sides. So Vietnam, over 3 million people died as the Cold War moved to Vietnam War. So Dien Bien Phu, 1954, was one of the defining battles of the Cold War. So the Vietnam War was a big defining moment that in many people's eyes. So the French lost control of their Vietnamese colony. They were defeated by Communist General Giap, and Vietnam was a nationalist and communist country. The International Peace Conference temporarily divided Vietnam into North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and agreed that countryside elections would be held in 1956. Americans opposed of this. This was something they didn't want to do, something they didn't want to get into because this wasn't a good idea that would benefit the US or benefit Vietnam. So it's kind of like what was happening in Berlin, but instead it was a full-blown country that was being divided into two. So Ho Chi Minh was North Vietnam's leader, and they embarked on a radical land reform. So in 1955, 1 million people fled to South Vietnam because North Vietnam was more of an aggressive leader and more demanding and hurt more of his people when he rose up to power. So South Vietnam was President Diem. He was an anti-communist. In 1960, to fight Diem and unite the country they wanted to unite the country under Hanoi, which is communists created the National Liberation Front, known as Viet Cong. Village leaders who supported Diem were being assassinated by the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong. In 1961, roughly 4,000 Diem officials were killed. So Diem's troops burned villages to the ground. In the summer of 1963, Buddhist monks burnt themselves to death in protest of Diem's religious intolerance. So they would go to big crowds and just light themselves on fire to show that they did not support him and to show that he wasn't the leader that they wanted, that they'd rather kill themselves in protest than ever be under his control. So November 1st, 1963, a group of generals attacked the presidential palace. They thought they had an American sport. The next day, government was overthrown and Diem and his brother were murdered by their own soldiers after they had earlier taken refuge in a church. So within 3 weeks of Diem's murder, President Kennedy was assassinated, and this was the biggest blow to the American people. And America still remained committed to South Vietnam, so they didn't take their grip off of South Vietnam because they saw a better life for Vietnam, the Vietnamese, and they saw an ally in them once they could unite the nation back together. So on the right side, this picture is Ho Chi Minh, and for General William and Westmoreland, he is a veteran of Korea and a World War II veteran. He took charge as President Johnson became to increase the American war effort. So in August 1964, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, exchanged fire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. So when American forces struck base used by the North Vietnamese patrol craft in the South Vietnam, the Viet Cong stepped up. They had 170,000 men and women in the field. Johnson won the election on November 3rd by a huge landslide. And North Vietnam was a peasant society with no industry because their leader was not looking after them. So Ho Chi Minh looked for aid from China and the Soviet Union. And in February 1965, Hanoi gave Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin a welcoming, and he agreed to increase military aid to the north. So Viet Cong launched an attack on Pleiku Air Base. So 8 Americans were killed, 800 more were wounded. So Johnson launched Rolling Thunder. This is a campaign of bombers against the North. So China is supplying less aid than the Soviet Union, even though they got few aircraft. North Vietnamese pilots were being trained in the Soviet Union. This was again another upset for Americans because we are again going up against